Deep in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, more than 2,000 miles from the coast of Chile, lies a small, isolated volcanic island. It's a place of profound mystery, famous for its giant stone statues, the Moai, which stand as silent sentinels gazing out to sea. This is Rapa Nui, known to the world as Easter Island. But beneath the shadows of these ancient figures, hidden within the island's very soil, lay another secret. A microscopic organism that would one day change the course of modern medicine. This secret was a bacterium, Streptomyces hygroscopicus, and from it, scientists would extract a compound with almost unbelievable powers. It would be named Rapamycin, a name that forever links it to the island of its origin, Rapa Nui. Imagine a single substance capable of turning down the body's own defenses, making life-saving organ transplants possible. Picture that same substance halting the runaway growth of cancer cells, or even holding the potential to slow the very process of aging. This is not science fiction. It is the reality of rapamycin. The story of this drug is a journey that begins with a speck of dirt, collected from one of the most remote places on Earth, and ends in the sterile, high-tech laboratories of pharmaceutical giants. It's a tale of scientific curiosity, of incredible discovery, and of life-saving innovation that has touched countless people around the globe, offering hope where there was once none. Yet, for all its celebrated success, the story of rapamycin is incomplete. It is a narrative that often begins with the scientists in their labs, celebrating their brilliant breakthrough. But the true beginning lies with the indigenous people of Rapa Nui, the guardians of the land from which this medical treasure was taken. Their role, their island, and their very bodies were central to the expedition that unearthed this miracle molecule. However, their contribution has been largely erased from the official history, lost in the excitement of scientific progress and the rush to commercialize a billion-dollar drug. This is the untold part of the story, a chapter that speaks of forgotten people and unanswered questions of fairness. This essay seeks to uncover that hidden history. We will travel back in time to the 1960s, to an island on the cusp of change, and meet the scientists who arrived with a mission. We will look at what they found, not just in the soil, but in the people they studied. We will explore the complex ethical questions that arise when discovery comes at the cost of acknowledgement and when immense profit is generated from a resource taken from a community without its full understanding or consent. The story of rapamycin is not just about a drug, it's about the human side of science and the enduring legacy of a small island's hidden gift to the world. To understand the profound impact of rapamycin, we must first look inside the human body, at the intricate dance of cells that keeps us alive. Our bodies are governed by a complex network of signals that tell our cells when to grow, when to divide, and when to rest. At the heart of this network is a master regulator, a protein that acts like a central command switch for cellular activity. Scientists call this protein the target of rapamycin, or TOR for short. When TOR is active, it signals cells to ramp up production, to grow and multiply. This process is essential for life, for building tissues and healing wounds. But when this switch gets stuck in the on position, it can lead to disaster. Rapamycin's genius lies in its ability to find this specific switch and turn it off. It works by inhibiting the TOR protein, effectively telling overactive cells to slow down and stop their uncontrolled growth. This is precisely why it became a cornerstone of transplant medicine. When a person receives a new organ, like a kidney or a heart, their immune system sees it as a foreign invader and launches a powerful attack to destroy it. This is called organ rejection. Rapamycin, marketed as Rapamune, acts as a powerful immunosuppressant. It quiets the immune system's aggressive response, preventing it from attacking the new life-sustaining organ and allowing the patient to live. But the story didn't end with organ transplants. Researchers soon realized that the TOR protein's role as a master growth regulator was also deeply implicated in cancer. Cancer is, at its core, a disease of uncontrolled cell growth. Malignant cells ignore the body's normal signals to stop dividing, leading to the formation of tumors. Because rapamycin could flip the off switch on cellular growth, It emerged as a promising anti-cancer agent. Today, derivatives of rapamycin are used to treat certain types of kidney, breast, and pancreatic cancers, shrinking tumors by cutting off their ability to grow and multiply. This discovery opened up a whole new frontier in oncology, offering a targeted therapy that was different from traditional chemotherapy. The potential of this humble soil bacterium continues to expand into astonishing new territories. Because the TOR pathway is also involved in metabolism and the aging process, scientists are now investigating rapamycin for a host of other conditions. Studies are exploring its use in treating diabetes, neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, and even its potential to extend lifespan and improve health in old age. A search on PubMed, the vast online library of biomedical research, reveals over 59,000 scientific articles dedicated to this single compound. From a pinch of dirt on a remote island has come a key that unlocks some of the deepest secrets of human biology, promising treatments for our most feared diseases. The year was 1964. The world was in the throes of the Cold War, and science was a frontier of intense exploration. In this climate of discovery, a team of Canadian scientists, with funding from the World Health Organization and logistical support from the Royal Canadian Navy, set their sights on Easter Island. This ambitious mission was called the Medical Expedition to Easter Island, or MITE. Its primary goal was not to hunt for miracle drugs in the soil, but to study the island's indigenous inhabitants, the Rapa Nui people. The scientists viewed the island as a perfect living laboratory, a place to observe a human population they believed had been almost completely isolated from the outside world for centuries. The expedition's leaders had a specific hypothesis they wanted to test. They believed the Rapa Nui people were a genetically pure, homogeneous group that had adapted over generations to the unique stresses of their remote environment. A new airport was scheduled to be built on the island in 1967, an event the researchers saw as a turning point that would end the island's long isolation forever. Their mission was to create a comprehensive biological snapshot of the Rapa Nui people before this change occurred. They wanted to study their diseases, their blood types, their genetic makeup, and their overall health to understand how an uncontaminated population coped with life. The expedition was a massive undertaking. The team included doctors, dentists, bacteriologists, and anthropologists. Upon their arrival, they set out to conduct medical examinations on every single person on the island, a population of just under 1,000 men, women, and children. They drew blood, collected saliva and tissue samples, took X-rays, and conducted extensive physical and dental exams. One of the scientists on this team was a bacteriologist named Dr. Georges Nogrady. As part of his work, he systematically collected over 200 soil samples from various locations across the island, bottling them up for later analysis back in his lab in Montreal. It was in one of these unassuming vials of dirt that the future of rapamycin lay dormant. The scientists believed they were on a noble quest for knowledge, one that would provide invaluable data for understanding human evolution and adaptation. They saw the Rapa Nui not as partners in research, but as subjects, a unique biological data set waiting to be collected before it was corrupted by modern life. The purpose was to create a baseline. The plan, at least in theory, was to return after the airport was built, to see what had changed. However, this follow-up study would never happen. The very premise of their mission was built on a fundamental misunderstanding of the island and its people, a flaw that would ultimately undermine their scientific goals and cast a long shadow over their methods. When the MITE team arrived, their approach to the Rapa Nui people was not one of collaboration, but of clinical detachment and subtle coercion. The islanders were viewed as objects of study, and ensuring their participation was the top priority. The researchers needed to collect samples from nearly the entire population to make their study statistically valid, and they employed several tactics to achieve this high level of compliance. They set up clinics, and with the help of a local priest, who held significant influence in the community, strongly encouraged everyone to participate in the comprehensive medical examinations. The line between a strong recommendation and a demand was, for many islanders, blurry at best. The relationship was inherently unequal. The scientists were outsiders with advanced technology, official backing, and a clear agenda. The Rapa Nui, many of whom had limited contact with the Western world, were in a position of vulnerability. To further encourage participation, the expedition team offered incentives. These were not formal payments or contracts, but small gifts of food, clothing, and other goods that were scarce on the isolated island. For a community with few material resources, these offerings were significant. This use of bribery, however well-intentioned it may have seemed to the researchers, created a dynamic where true informed consent, the ethical cornerstone of modern research, was virtually impossible to obtain. The islanders had little to no say in how the research was conducted, or what would become of the biological samples taken from their bodies. They were told the examinations were for their health, but the broader scientific purpose, to study them as a genetically isolated group before the airport arrived, was not fully explained in a way they could understand or question. Their bodies, their blood, and their DNA were treated as natural resources, to be harvested for scientific data. The concept of the Rapa Nui people as active partners in the research, or as individuals with a right to control their own biological information, was simply not part of the scientific mindset of the era. This transactional and paternalistic approach is now widely seen as a classic example of scientific colonialism. It reflects a time when Western researchers often traveled to remote parts of the world and conducted studies on indigenous populations without their input, consent, or benefit. The Rapa Nui were subjected to intense scrutiny, their most personal biological details recorded and taken away to laboratories thousands of miles away. They were essential to the mission's success, yet they were treated as passive subjects rather than sovereign people. This imbalance of power is a critical part of the story, shaping not only the events of 1964, but also the ethical debates that continue to this day. The entire scientific premise of the Mite mission rested on a critical and ultimately incorrect assumption that the Rapa Nui people were a genetically pure and isolated population. The researchers imagined them as a human time capsule, a group untouched by outside genetic influence since their Polynesian ancestors first settled the island centuries ago. This romanticized vision of isolation was essential to their goal of studying how a pristine human group adapted to its environment. However, this picture was a fantasy, a product of Western imagination rather than historical fact. The island's history was far more complex and worldly than the scientists believed. In reality, Rapa Nui had been a site of contact, conflict, and migration for centuries. The first European contact occurred in 1722, and from that point on, a steady stream of ships, whalers, explorers, and traders visited the island. These encounters were not always peaceful. In the 19th century, Peruvian slave raiders devastated the population, kidnapping a huge portion of the islanders, including most of the community's leaders and knowledge keepers. While a few survivors eventually returned, they brought with them diseases like smallpox that further decimated the population. The people the Mite team studied in 1964 were the descendants of this turbulent history, a resilient community with a mixed heritage that included Polynesian, European, South American, and even African ancestry. This historical reality completely undermined the expedition's core scientific objective. Their goal of assessing the genetic risk for diseases in a supposedly pure population was based on a false premise. The genetic diversity they were trying to measure had already been shaped by centuries of outside contact and population bottlenecks. This fundamental miscalculation is likely the reason why the planned follow-up study, meant to take place after the airport was built, never materialized. The baseline data they had so painstakingly collected was flawed from the start, rendering any future comparison scientifically questionable. The living laboratory was not the controlled experiment they had imagined. The scientists' failure to see this reality speaks to a powerful bias that was common in mid-20th century anthropology and medicine. They projected their own ideas of primitivism and isolation onto the Rapa Nui people, ignoring historical evidence that was readily available. They saw what they wanted to see: a simple, untouched society that could serve their scientific narrative. This flawed perspective not only compromised their research, but also disrespected the true complex history of the Rapa Nui people. The expedition was built on a shaky foundation, a scientific house of cards that could not stand up to the weight of historical truth. Section 6. The Invisible Hand. Forgetting the source. While the Mite mission's primary goals may have been flawed, an accidental discovery of immense value emerged from it. That discovery began with vial number A449, one of the many soil samples collected by Dr. George Nogrady. After the expedition, Nogrady shared his collection with researchers at Airst Research Laboratories in Montreal. There, in the mid-1970s, a scientist named Dr. Surendra Sehgal and his team began the arduous process of screening the samples for any interesting microbial activity. They found what they were looking for in the sample from Easter Island, a bacterium producing a compound that powerfully inhibited the growth of fungi. They named the compound Rapamycin. Initially, Rapamycin was developed as an antifungal agent, but its clinical development was halted when researchers noticed it also had a powerful effect on the immune system. This side effect, which would have been a deal-breaker for an antifungal drug, turned out to be its most important feature. Dr. Sehgal, recognizing its potential, courageously rescued the research from being shut down. He famously stored vials of the rapamycin-producing bacteria in his home freezer after his company decided to abandon the project. Years later, when the need for better immunosuppressants became critical for the burgeoning field of organ transplantation, Sehgal revived the research, leading to the development of Rapamycin. However, as the story of rapamycin was written in scientific journals and company press releases, some key details were left out. In the landmark publications authored by Surendra Sehgal that detailed the isolation and properties of rapamycin, there was no mention of Dr. George Nogrady, the man who had collected the soil sample. Nor was there any credit given to the Mite mission, the expedition that made the collection possible. The origin story was simplified, starting not on a remote island with a complex history, but in a laboratory with a petri dish. The link back to Rapa Nui and the people who were the very reason for the expedition was severed. This omission, whether intentional or not, had a profound effect on the narrative. It erased the contributions of others and centered the story solely on the pharmaceutical discovery. The soil sample from Easter Island was treated as a raw, ownerless material, like a rock picked up from a deserted landscape. The fact that it was collected during a human-centered study on indigenous land, and as part of a mission that involved the entire Rapa Nui population, was deemed irrelevant. The context was lost, and with it, any sense of obligation to the place and the people from which this billion-dollar discovery originated. The hands that had collected the soil, and the community that had hosted them, became invisible. Section 7. The Shadow of Biopiracy. Who owns a discovery? The story of rapamycin raises uncomfortable but essential questions about ownership, fairness, and exploitation, a concept often called biopiracy. Biopiracy refers to the practice of taking natural resources, like plants or microorganisms, or using the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples for commercial purposes without obtaining proper permission or sharing the profits. In the case of rapamycin, a bacterium was taken from Rapa Nui soil and developed into a portfolio of drugs that have generated billions of dollars in revenue for pharmaceutical companies. Yet, the Rapa Nui people have received no financial benefit, no formal acknowledgement, and no share in the immense wealth created from their island's biodiversity. When the Mite expedition took place in 1964, the ethical landscape of global science was very different. There were no international laws governing access to genetic resources or ensuring the fair sharing of benefits. The prevailing attitude was that the world's biodiversity was the common heritage of mankind, free for anyone to take and use. However, this perspective began to change dramatically in the following decades, as indigenous groups and developing nations started to protest the exploitation of their resources and knowledge. This movement led to landmark international agreements designed to protect their rights and ensure a more equitable system. Two key agreements now shape these discussions. The first is the 1992 United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, which established that countries have sovereign rights over their own genetic resources. It introduced the principle of access and benefit sharing, meaning that anyone wishing to use a country's biological resources must first get permission and then negotiate a fair way to share any resulting benefits. The second is the 2007 UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which reinforces the right of indigenous communities to control their own lands, resources, and traditional knowledge, and to give or withhold their free, prior, and informed consent for any project affecting them. Of course, these laws were not in place in 1964, so they cannot be applied retroactively to the collection of the rapamycin-producing bacterium. This legal gray area is often used to argue that no wrongdoing occurred. The companies that profited from rapamycin operated within the legal framework of their time. However, ethics are not always defined by laws. The absence of a law does not mean that an action was right or just. The case of rapamycin forces us to look beyond legal technicalities and ask a deeper moral question. What is owed to a community whose land and people were the starting point for a life-changing, multi-billion-dollar discovery? Section 8. A debt unpaid. The debate over recognition. The question of whether the Rapa Nui people should be compensated or formally recognized for their role in the discovery of rapamycin is a complex one, with arguments on both sides. Those who argue against compensation often point out that the laws requiring benefit sharing did not exist in 1964. They contend that holding companies to today's standards for actions taken decades ago is unfair. Furthermore, they argue that the Rapa Nui people had no prior knowledge of the bacterium or its powerful properties. The discovery required years of sophisticated scientific research and development in a lab far from the island. The value, they say, was created not by the soil itself, but by the scientists who unlocked its secrets. Another common argument is that the bacterium is not unique to Easter Island. Since its initial discovery, similar strains have been found in soil from other parts of the world. This fact is used to suggest that the discovery was not exclusively tied to Rapa Nui. It could have happened elsewhere. Therefore, the connection to the island is seen as incidental, a matter of historical chance rather than a unique and essential contribution. From this perspective, there is no special debt owed to the Rapa Nui people because their island was simply the first place, but not the only place, where the organism was found. However, the counter-arguments are powerful and rooted in a different understanding of justice. The fact remains that the discovery made there, and it was made possible only because the Matai expedition was on the island to study the Rapa Nui people. The soil collection was not an independent geological survey. It was an integrated part of a medical mission focused on the island's human inhabitants. Without the Rapa Nui as the subjects of the study, the expedition would not have happened. Dr. Negrady would not have been there, and that specific vial of soil would never have been collected. The people and the soil are inextricably linked in the chain of events that led to rapamycin. Proponents of recognition argue that this connection creates a moral, if not legal, obligation. The story of rapamycin is not just about a bacterium, it's about a relationship, however flawed, between scientists and an indigenous community. To ignore the Rapa Nui's role is to perpetuate the colonial mindset that indigenous peoples and their lands are simply raw materials for Western science and commerce. While some pharmaceutical companies have started to create policies for benefit sharing and new discoveries, those that have directly profited from rapamycin have yet to formally acknowledge the Rapa Nui people's place at the beginning of this incredible story. The debt, many believe, remains unpaid. Section 9. Rewriting the story. Acknowledging the unseen contributors. The story of rapamycin is more than a tale of scientific triumph. It is a powerful lesson in the ethics of discovery. It forces us to look into the shadows of history and see the people who have been left out of the narrative. Acknowledging the role of the Rapa Nui people is not about rewriting history to assign blame, it is about completing it. It's about adding the missing chapter that connects a modern medical miracle back to the remote island and the indigenous community that hosted the scientists who made the initial find. Doing so provides a richer, more honest account of how science truly happens, not just in sterile labs, but in real-world places with complex human histories. This acknowledgement is crucial for the future of science. As researchers continue to explore the world's biodiversity for new medicines, they will increasingly work in and among indigenous communities. The old model of scientific colonialism, where researchers could take what they wanted without consent or compensation, is no longer acceptable. A new model, based on partnership, respect, and equity, must take its place. Recognizing the Rapa Nui's contribution to the Rapamycin story sends a powerful message that indigenous peoples are not merely subjects of study or sources of raw material, but are essential partners in the quest for knowledge, deserving of respect and a share in the benefits. For the Rapa Nui people today, this is not just about money. It is about dignity and justice. It is about having their history and their island's contribution to global health recognized on the world stage. Formal acknowledgement from the pharmaceutical companies that have profited from rapamycin, perhaps in the form of investment in local health and education initiatives on the island, would be a meaningful step toward rectifying a historical imbalance. It would transform the story from one of extraction to one of reciprocity, creating a legacy that honors everyone involved. It would show that it's never too late to do the right thing. Ultimately, the untold story of rapamycin challenges all of us to think more critically about where our medicines come from. Behind every pill can be a story that stretches back decades, involving people and places we may never have considered. By telling the full story of rapamycin, including the flawed expedition, the forgotten community, and the unacknowledged contribution, we reaffirm a fundamental principle: that scientific progress should not come at the cost of human dignity. The greatest discoveries are those that not only advance human health, but also honor our shared humanity. The legacy of Easter Island's hidden gift is not just a molecule, but a moral compass for the future.